The Nazis didn't understand how 10,000 Jews were escaping Hungary until they learned one man used his pen as a weapon. Raoul Wallenberg. November 1944, 7:23 a.m. József Város train station, Budapest, Hungary. Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann watched with barely contained irritation as yet another deportation train departed with fewer Jews than expected. He had planned to load 2,000. It carried only 1,400. 600 had disappeared overnight. How is that possible? He shouted at his subordinate. We have Budapest surrounded, ghettos sealed, constant patrols. How do 600 Jews vanish? His subordinate, nervous, replied, "The documents, sir. They have documents that look legitimate. Swedish passports, protection certificates. Our guards don't know whether they're real or fake." Eichmann slammed his fist on the desk. He was the architect of the Holocaust in Hungary, responsible for deporting 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz between May and July 1944. It had been a machine of efficiency. But since July, when Horthy halted the deportations, and especially since October, when the Arrow Cross Party took power, something had changed. Jews who should have been on trains to Auschwitz were presenting foreign protection papers. Entire buildings were claiming extraterritorial status. Thousands were vanishing into protected houses, supposedly under Swedish jurisdiction. Who is behind this? Eichmann asked. A Swede, sir. A young diplomat. Wallenberg. Raoul Wallenberg. Eichmann knew the name. He had seen it in multiple reports. But how could a diplomat from a neutral country, without an army, without weapons, without military power, frustrate an operation that had murdered 500,000 Jews in months? What Eichmann didn't understand, what he wouldn't understand until after the war, when testimonies revealed the full truth, was that Raoul Wallenberg had turned the most mundane tool imaginable, paper, ink, official stamps, into the most effective weapon of resistance in Budapest. He had designed a document that had no real legal validity, but looked so official that the Nazis respected it out of sheer bureaucratic reflex. And with those fake but convincing papers, Wallenberg built a system that would save not hundreds, but tens of thousands of lives. Not with violence, but with administrative audacity so extreme it bordered on the absurd. This is the story of how a 32-year-old Swedish diplomat turned Budapest into a paper fortress against genocide. How bureaucracy became a weapon against totalitarianism. And how one man, armed with nothing but extraordinary courage and a talent for forging documents, saved more Jews than almost any other non-Jew in World War II. The man before the mission. Raoul Gustav Wallenberg was born on August 4th, 1912, in Stockholm, into one of Sweden's most prominent families. The Wallenbergs were a banking and diplomatic dynasty, the Swedish equivalent of the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers. Wealth, power, connections that opened any door. But Raoul was complicated. His father, a naval officer, died of cancer 3 months before Raoul's birth. He grew up under the guidance of his paternal grandfather, Gustav Wallenberg, a diplomat and banker who had a very specific vision for the boy. Cosmopolitan education, exposure to multiple cultures, preparation for leadership in international business. At 17, Raoul was sent to study architecture at the University of Michigan in the United States. It was an unusual choice for the heir to a banking dynasty, but Raoul had a genuine passion for design, for creating spaces that improved human lives. He graduated with honors in 1935. He spent months traveling across the United States during the Great Depression, seeing poverty, inequality, and suffering that contrasted violently with the privilege of his upbringing. It was an education in humanity his grandfather had not planned, yet it shaped Raoul's character more than any university course. He returned to Sweden in 1936. He worked briefly at a family bank, but grew bored. Banking didn't use his skills. It didn't satisfy his need to do something that mattered. He took a job at an import-export company run by a Hungarian Jew named Koloman Lauer. Lauer, who had escaped anti-Semitism in Hungary, recognized something in Raoul. A rare combination of privilege that opened doors and genuine empathy that made him want to use that privilege for good. The two developed a close friendship. Raoul traveled frequently to Budapest on business, knew the city, and spoke some Hungarian. By 1944, when the situation for Hungary's Jews became desperate, Lauer had connections to the American War Refugee Board, an organization established by Roosevelt to rescue European Jews. They needed someone in Budapest, someone neutral, someone with access to resources, someone extraordinarily brave. Lauer suggested Raoul Wallenberg. It was an unlikely choice. A 31-year-old architect with no diplomatic experience, no rescue operation training, no track record of heroism. But he had unique advantages. A Swedish passport from a neutral country, family wealth that conferred credibility, and something intangible Lauer had noticed: an eagerness to risk everything from the start. In June 1944, the War Refugee Board and the Swedish government agreed to send Wallenberg to Budapest as a secretary of the legation, a minor diplomatic title that granted immunity but carried no major official responsibilities. His real mission: save as many Hungarian Jews as possible by any means necessary. Wallenberg accepted without hesitation. On July 9, 1944, he arrived in Budapest carrying a list of 600 Jews in urgent need of protection, money provided by the War Refugee Board, and absolutely no clear idea how he would accomplish the impossible mission he was about to attempt. Hungary in 1944. To understand the genius of Wallenberg's operation, we need to understand Hungary's unique situation in 1944. Hungary was allied with Nazi Germany, but retained relative autonomy under Regent Admiral Miklós Horthy. Unlike Poland or the Netherlands, where the Nazis implemented genocide immediately, Hungary had largely protected its 800,000 Jews until 1944. There was discrimination, yes, but no mass deportations. That changed violently on March 19, 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary, fearing Horthy might negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. Adolf Eichmann arrived personally to oversee the final solution in Hungary. What followed was genocide at terrifying speed and efficiency. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, less than 2 months, Eichmann deported 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. It was one of the fastest, deadliest operations of the entire Holocaust. Trains left daily with thousands. Most were murdered immediately upon arrival. By July, only around 200,000 Jews remained, almost all in Budapest. Under Sapró international pressure, Horthy temporarily halted deportations. But the situation was precarious. Deportations could resume at any moment. It was precisely at this moment, July 9th, that Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest, a city where 500,000 people had been deported in weeks, where the machinery of death ran like an industrial process, where the probability of success seemed close to zero. But Wallenberg had an advantage Eichmann didn't anticipate. He understood that for all their brutality, the Nazis were fundamentally bureaucrats. They respected papers, forms, official stamps. Their system depended on meticulous documentation, and Wallenberg was about to exploit that dependence in a way that would save tens of thousands. The invention of the Schutz Pass. Wallenberg's first move in Budapest was to visit the Swedish legation and assess the existing operation. He found that Swedish diplomats had already issued about 700 protection certificates for Jews with family or business connections to Sweden. These were simple documents, letters on official letterhead declaring that the bearer was under Swedish protection and awaiting emigration to Sweden. Technically, they had no legal value. Sweden had no authority to grant citizenship unilaterally. But they looked official, and the Nazis often respected them out of bureaucratic confusion. Wallenberg saw the potential. If 700 documents could save 700 people, why not 7,000 or 70,000? But the existing certificates were inadequate. They looked like ordinary letters, easy to dismiss. Wallenberg needed something more impressive, more official, more intimidating. He needed documents the Nazis would instinctively respect. Using his background in architecture and design, Wallenberg created the Schutz Pass, protective passport. It was a masterpiece of psychological design. Format, standard passport size, folded into 3 sections, familiar to bureaucrats used to travel documents. Colors, yellow and blue, Sweden's flag colors, visually distinctive, hard to confuse. Symbols, a prominent Swedish crown and the 3 crowns coat of arms, symbols of royal authority implying full state backing. Text, printed in Hungarian, German, and Swedish, declaring the bearer under Swedish government protection, awaiting repatriation, and meanwhile, under Swedish legation jurisdiction. Photo and signatures. A photo, multiple signatures, and official-looking seals. More official than many genuine documents. Serial number. Each pass had a unique number, implying a proper bureaucratic registry. Crucially, the Schutz Pass had no real legal validity. Sweden had not agreed to accept tens of thousands of refugees. The Hungarian government had not officially recognized these documents. It was essentially an elaborate forgery. But it looked so official, so important, so bureaucratically correct, that Nazi and Hungarian authorities often accepted it. Especially lower-level guards who didn't want to risk the consequences of rejecting a document that might be legitimate. Wallenberg began printing Schutz passes on an industrial scale. He set up an office inside the Swedish legation that operated like a document factory. He hired dozens of Hungarian Jews as staff, giving them practical diplomatic protection while they produced papers that would save thousands more. By August 1944, he was issuing hundreds of Schutz passes each week. By September, thousands. The protected houses. But the Schutz Pass was only the first step. Wallenberg faced a practical problem. Where would all these people with protection papers actually live? The ghettos were dangerous and subject to raids. They needed physical refuge the Nazis would hesitate to violate. Wallenberg developed the concept of protected houses. Entire buildings declared as annexes of the Swedish legation, technically Swedish territory under extraterritorial protection. It was an audacious legal fiction. Legations typically consist of a single diplomatic building. Wallenberg declared that dozens of buildings across Budapest were Swedish territory. He had no true authority to do this. The Hungarian government had not approved it. But he acted with such absolute confidence that authorities assumed it must be legal. He bought and rented buildings using War Refugee Board funds. He hung huge Swedish flags on the facades. He installed plaques declaring, "This building is under the protection of the Swedish legation." Entry forbidden without permission. Inside these buildings, he crammed thousands of Jews. Conditions were brutal. Buildings meant for 50 held 300. But it was relative safety in a city where the alternative was deportation. By October 1944, Wallenberg ran a network of 31 protected houses sheltering roughly 15,000 Jews. It was a massive logistical operation. Food, water, sanitation, security. He employed hundreds, creating a parallel bureaucracy as complex as municipal. Administration. The Nazis, confused by the apparent legitimacy, generally respected the houses. Occasionally, they attempted raids, but Wallenberg or his staff would appear with papers, argue diplomatic jurisdiction, cite international conventions. Nazi officials, trained to respect procedures, often backed down. It was paper against power. Wallenberg had created physical protection using nothing but legal fiction, projected with absolute conviction. Extreme audacity. But Wallenberg's true genius wasn't only document design or protected houses. It was personal audacity. His willingness to confront Nazis directly with nothing but confidence and forged authority. Josef Varos Station Incident, October 1944. Wallenberg learned the Nazis were loading Jews onto a deportation train. He rushed to the station, arriving as the freight car doors were closing. He stood in front of the train and shouted in German, "This train cannot leave. There are Swedish citizens on board." SS. Officers ordered him to move. Wallenberg refused. He climbed onto the roof of a rail car and began passing Schutz passes through the windows. "If you have this, get out. You are under Swedish protection." Nazi guards fired at him, deliberately missing to intimidate. Wallenberg continued calmly distributing papers. About 100 people climbed down, holding Schutz passes. Wallenberg escorted them out of the station. Technically, the Nazis could have arrested him. They could have ignored the papers. But his absolute confidence, his performance of legitimate diplomatic authority, created enough confusion that guards allowed the rescue. Death March Incident, November 1944. When deportations by train became difficult due to the Soviet advance, the Nazis forced thousands of Jews into death marches toward Austria. 200-kilometer winter treks without adequate food, clothing, or shelter. Wallenberg drove along the route, handing out Schutz passes to marchers. He confronted guards. "These people are under Swedish protection. They must be released." Guards argued the documents weren't valid outside Budapest. Wallenberg insisted Swedish jurisdiction extended to all Schutz pass holders. He cited international conventions that didn't apply. He threatened diplomatic consequences he couldn't truly enforce. But he spoke with such authority, such conviction, that guards often yielded. Through multiple rescues along the march routes, Wallenberg saved hundreds more. Confrontation with Eichmann, November 1944. At a dinner hosted by Hungarian officials, Wallenberg was introduced to Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann, aware of Wallenberg's reputation, made a threat. Accidents can happen, even to neutral diplomats. Wallenberg replied calmly, "Yes, accidents can happen. Also to SS officers after Germany loses this war. Make sure you're remembered on the right side of history." It was an audacious threat to the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann, startled by the directness, said nothing. Wallenberg had called his bluff. The complete system. By November 1944, Wallenberg had built a rescue system on an industrial scale. Document production. An office inside the Swedish legation produced Schutz passes at a furious pace. A staff of about 40 worked around the clock. Printing presses ran constantly. Historians estimate between 20,000 and 30,000 Schutzpasses were issued, though the exact number is impossible to determine. Protected houses. 31 buildings sheltering about 15,000 people. A food network fed thousands. A medical system treated illness. Improvised schools taught children. Informant network. Employees inside Hungarian administration provided early warnings about planned raids. Wallenberg could evacuate threatened houses or move people before the Nazis arrived. Active rescues. Teams led by Wallenberg or his staff intercepted deportations at train stations, march routes, even inside ghettos, handing out Schutzpasses, arguing, jurisdiction, pulling people literally off trains. International coordination. Wallenberg worked with other neutral diplomats, Swiss, Spanish, Portuguese, sharing tactics and expanding protection. Together, they created the International Ghetto in Budapest, where about 33,000 Jews lived under combined protection. Financing. The War Refugee Board provided about $100,000, roughly $1.7 million today. Wallenberg also used personal funds and borrowed from Swedish contacts. The money funded buildings, food, and bribes to corrupt officials. Personnel. He employed hundreds of Hungarian Jews. By employing them in the legation, he effectively gave them diplomatic protection, while massively expanding operational capacity. It was a rescue machine as organized, as bureaucratically complex as the genocidal machine it fought. But it ran on paper, not guns, on audacity, not violence. The Siege of Budapest, December 1944. The Red Army encircled Budapest. A siege began that would last until February 1945. The city became a brutal urban battlefield. For the remaining Jews, the siege created a double danger. The Nazis and Arrow Cross, knowing the war was lost, intensified killing. They could no longer deport efficiently, so they executed directly. Death squads dragged Jews to the banks of the Danube, shot them, and let their bodies fall into the river. Wallenberg expanded operations desperately. Protected houses came under artillery fire. Food ran out, yet he continued, moving through a bombarded city, rescuing people one by one. Great Ghetto Incident, January 1945. The Arrow Cross planned to massacre 70,000 Jews confined in the Great Ghetto. Wallenberg confronted a Hungarian commander. "If you allow this massacre, I will be a witness at your war crimes trial." It was a bluff. Wallenberg had no authority to guarantee trials. But the threat worked. The commander, worried about his future, canceled the massacre. 70,000 lives saved by a conversation. On January 13, 1945, Soviet troops entered Budapest. The ghetto was liberated. Wallenberg had achieved the impossible, keeping tens of thousands alive through months of genocide and siege. The disappearance on January 17, 1945. 4 days after liberation, Raoul Wallenberg was contacted by Soviet officers. They asked him to accompany them to Soviet headquarters in Debrecen. They claimed the Soviet commander wanted to thank him for his rescue efforts. Wallenberg agreed, taking his driver, Vilmos Langfelder. They drove towards Soviet lines. He never returned. What happened next remains a mystery to this day. The Soviets initially claimed they had no knowledge of Wallenberg. Later they said he died in prison in 1947. Then they changed the story multiple times. The most likely explanation? The Soviets suspected Wallenberg was an American spy. The War Refugee Board had connections to the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. Wallenberg carried American money and worked with American support. In post-war, Paranoia, that was enough to arrest him. He was taken to Moscow, likely interrogated, possibly executed. The Wallenberg family spent decades seeking answers, pressuring Soviet and later Russian authorities for information. They never obtained definitive confirmation. Raoul Wallenberg vanished into the Soviet prison system, victim of the very regime that had helped defeat the Nazis he had fought so brilliantly. Legacy. The numbers tell a powerful story. When Wallenberg arrived in Budapest in July 1944, about 200,000 Jews remained in the city. When Budapest was liberated in January 1945, about 120,000 survived. It is impossible to attribute survival in wartime to a single person with absolute certainty, but historians estimate Wallenberg directly saved 20,000 to 30,000 people through Schutz passes and protected houses. Indirectly, his example inspired other neutral diplomats: Swiss Karl Lutz, Spaniard Angel Sanz Briz, who together saved tens of thousands more. Comparisons with other rescuers show the scale. Oskar Schindler, 1,200 Jews saved Irina Sendler. 2,500 children saved Nicholas Winton. 669 children saved Raoul Wallenberg. 20,000 to 100,000 saved, depending on how indirect impact is counted. Wallenberg saved more Jews than almost any other individual non-Jew during World War II. And he did it not with weapons, but with paper, ink, and extraordinary audacity. In 1981, the U.S. Congress granted Wallenberg honorary American citizenship, only the second person in U.S. history to receive it, after Winston Churchill. In 1985, Israel named him righteous among the nations. Statues, memorials, and streets bear his name in cities around the world. Survivors Speak, interviews with survivors reveal the personal impact of Wallenberg's operation. Tomas Veres, saved at age 12. My family was on a train to Auschwitz. Wallenberg climbed onto the roof of the wagon and handed Schutz passes through the windows. My mother grabbed one. The guards let us get off. 3 days later, that train arrived at Auschwitz. Everyone was murdered immediately. I'm alive because a Swede climbed onto a train roof under Nazi gunfire and passed us a piece of paper. Susan Tabor, saved at age 8. We lived in a protected house on Podzoni Street. We were constantly hungry, cold, terrified, but we were alive. Wallenberg visited regularly, checking conditions. Once he brought chocolate. I don't know where he found it. He handed it out personally. I remember his hands. They were the hands of someone who could have been in a mansion, but chose to be in the ghetto. Those hands gave me chocolate and life. Ervin Koranyi, saved at age 19. I was captured by the Arrow Cross and taken to the Danube to be executed. They lined 50 of us up. They started shooting from one end. I was in the middle, waiting for the bullet. Then I heard a voice shouting in German. Wallenberg had arrived. He argued we were Swedish citizens, protected. It was madness. We were Hungarian. Jews, not Swedes. But he acted with such authority that the officers hesitated. While they argued, some of us ran. I survived because the man insisted on a legal fiction with absolute conviction. Analysis. Why it worked. Wallenberg's operation succeeded for reasons that reveal vulnerabilities in the Nazi system. Exploiting the bureaucratic mindset. The Nazis were procedure-obsessed bureaucrats. Genocide was implemented through papers, forms, written orders. Wallenberg created documents that looked so official the Nazis respected them by reflex. It was a psychological hack, using their bureaucratic addiction against them. Swedish neutrality. Sweden was neutral and important to German trade. The Nazis didn't want a diplomatic conflict. When Wallenberg invoked Swedish jurisdiction, he created ambiguity the Nazis preferred to avoid. Wartime chaos. By late 1944, Germany was losing. Nazi administration was fraying. Communication was difficult. A Schutzpass that might have been challenged in 1941 was accepted in 1944 because no one had time to verify. Personal audacity, Wallenberg demanded. He didn't plead. He cited international law, threatened diplomatic consequences. His class, education, and family connections projected authority ordinary people couldn't. Coordination with other rescuers, Swiss, Spanish, and Portuguese diplomats, issued similar papers. Combined, they created a protection system too large to be ignored entirely. Timing. He arrived at the most vulnerable moment, after mass deportations, but before final liberation. 6 months earlier, he'd likely have been crushed by Nazi efficiency. 6 months later, he wouldn't have been needed. Resources War Refugee Board funding enabled buildings, food, and bribes. Without money, audacity alone would not have scaled. The moral question. But Wallenberg's operation raises an uncomfortable question. Was it legal? No. The Schutzpasses had no real legal validity. The protected houses had no legitimate diplomatic status. Wallenberg forged documents, lied about authority, and operated far beyond any official diplomatic mandate. Under strict international law, much of what he did was technically illegal, but it saved tens of thousands of lives. That is the central tension of resistance against genocide. Legality versus morality. Nazi laws required deporting Jews. Resisting was illegal, but obeying was immoral. Wallenberg chose morality over legality. He forged papers because truth killed. He lied because honesty murdered. He operated illegally because legality had become genocidal. In post-war testimony, no survivor questioned the legality of his Schutzpass. Everyone emphasized the same point. The fake paper saved real life. As Susan Tabor said in an interview, people ask whether the documents were real. My answer is, I'm alive. My children exist. My grandchildren exist. That is a real document. The paper Wallenberg gave me may have been a legal fiction, but the life it allowed me to live is absolute truth. Epilogue. The mystery continues to this day. Wallenberg's disappearance remains unresolved. The Russian government officially maintains he died in prison in 1947. But evidence is contradictory. Unconfirmed reports suggest he may have lived in the Soviet prison system into the 1960s, possibly even the 1970s. The Wallenberg family spent decades and millions searching for answers. Sweden pressured the Soviets, then Russia, for information. International commissions investigated. Nothing definitive emerged. In 2016, a Swedish investigation officially concluded Wallenberg was probably executed in July 1947. But many, including members of his family, reject that conclusion. What is indisputable is the legacy. Raoul Wallenberg, who lived only 32 years and operated in Budapest for only 6 months, saved more lives than almost any other individual rescuer of the Holocaust. The final word belongs to Erzsébet Epstein, saved by a Schutzpass in October 1944, who wrote in 1985. Raoul Wallenberg understood something the Nazis never did, that humanity cannot be eliminated by decree, that a paper with a seal can protect life if the person behind the paper has the courage to insist it is valid. That bureaucracy, built for genocide, can be hacked for salvation. The Nazis built a system to kill. Wallenberg built a system to save. His tools were pathetic compared to theirs. Paper versus trains, ink versus gas, stamps versus guns. But his tools won because they were animated by something the Nazis did not have: the will to risk everything for people he had never met. I never knew what happened to him after January 1945. But I know what happened to me. I lived. I married. I had children. Now I have grandchildren. Each of us exists because a Swede decided his life was worth less than ours. His safety mattered less than our survival. The mystery of his disappearance is tragedy. But the certainty of his impact is triumph. Tens of thousands lived because one man turned a pen into a weapon more powerful than any Nazi rifle. The Nazis didn't understand how 10,000 Jews were escaping Hungary. They searched for complex conspiracies, secret military operations, explanations that fit their worldview. They never understood the simple truth. One man with a pen, paper, and absolute courage can defeat an army with weapons if he exploits the enemy's fundamental weakness. The Nazi weakness was their faith in bureaucracy, their religious respect for official documents, their inability to imagine someone would forge papers with audacity so extreme it became indistinguishable from real authority. Wallenberg imagined. He forged. He saved. And that is why, even though his body disappeared in a Soviet prison, his spirit lives in every descendant of the people he saved. We are his legacy. We are proof that paper can be stronger than power, ink more deadly than blood, and ordinary humanity, armed with extraordinary audacity, can defeat organized evil. One man, one pen, tens of thousands saved. The Nazis never understood. That's why they lost.